Welcome to Dairy Pod, a podcast series from Dairy Australia. Featuring a range of experts, each episode offers insights into Australia's unique dairy farming conditions, as well as personal experiences and the latest in dairy innovation.
So thanks so much for joining us on the podcast, Donna. Can you start by telling us a little bit about your background?
So I grew up on a dairy farm in the McAllister Irrigation District. And from there, I guess I went and did a Bachelor of Agricultural Science at the University of Melbourne. Then came back home to the farm where I suppose I just sort of helped out looking for, until I got a job working in a stock feed company where I worked for sort of 8 years. And in that time also did the Australian Association of Ruminant Nutrition exam membership by exam. I did that in the first year that they kicked that off, which was a huge learning curve again, really, in that section. And then I worked in it for an animal health company for 2 years before joining Debenham Australia. Work with clients, particularly on, nutritional strategies and their farm and approaches and, whatever's sort of needed there in that regard.
That's amazing. So, Donna, I've asked you to come onto the podcast today, because I think you're amazing at your job, but critically, we know that there's sort of feed shortages right across Victoria, but across vast areas of the country with the flooding up in northern New South Wales. Do we know what's driving the feed shortages at the moment, Donna?
I suppose the combination of a couple of years of, even drought-like conditions through southern Australia as well. So while there's a lot of rain up north, which is forcing feed up there or losses of feed, obviously there's a lot of shortages of feed, particularly through the west. And then, South Gippsland and West Gippsland have obviously had a shortfalls of rain as well. So while where I am at Maffra, it's, we've sort of been, hidden a little bit, and through parts of East Gippsland, it's also started to really get a bit drier with a drier winter as well in patches too. So I think it's just been very patchy, and it has been dry, so there hasn't been the fodder taken off, and there's not the fodder reserves, and people are chasing that. But I don't get over to Western Victoria that often, but yeah, I do well and truly understand that it's pretty desperate over there.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, I guess, the crux of why we've asked you to come on, Donna, because obviously you've got a wealth of experience working directly with farmers right across Victoria, but obviously heavily concentrated in the Gippsland area. But you're just so practical and pragmatic sort of in your approach. So, I mean, this podcast, the audience is farmers right across the country. So if farmers are they're facing feed shortages and they just haven't got those, that feed on hand, what's sort of some of the first things that they need to be thinking about, or, if they're looking at how they're going to get through the next couple of months?
Well, I guess the thing is, it's always about being able to ensure that we have a bit of a feed budget. And, I know everyone talks about everyone should always have a feed budget, but there's no point. I suppose a lot of farmers have it in their head, but even if you had a feed budget, you probably wouldn't have planned for this length of time being short for feed, and everyone would be expecting the grass to have come into play now. And when we are, I guess, heading into spring, but soil moisture is still obviously a concern across a lot of regions. So, having a bit of a feed budget, but not necessarily just on feed, but on, your stocks, like your cattle stocks, what needs to be fed, what do you need to focus on, and probably working backwards from then. Fibre prices is really what's driving a lot of it. Like, fibre's what's expensive. That's the hardest probably part of it all. Grain, relative to the last 5 years, I think, looking at the Dairy Australia reports, it probably is sitting middle of the row. Canola meal, again, is sort of middle of the road. So those sorts of products aren't excessively dear. They're still expensive enough, but they're not at the highs as what the fibre sources are. So your hays and those sorts of products is really what we're chasing and are at, extreme highs.
So, Donna, talk me through, and I think you picked up a really good point that a lot of the time people have sort of got it mapped out in their head and they've got a pretty good gut feel as to how they're going and what they might need. What do you mean when you say, get a feed budget? Can it still be in your head? What's the benefit of potentially getting it down on paper? Can you talk us through sort of why there's the benefit of doing that?
Well, everybody's a little bit different on how they want to approach it. I think it can definitely help on stress levels for people if they've got it on a piece of paper rather than in their head, and sharing that, not only just that it's within their head, but within their team, whether it be a partner or staff or managers or whatever, putting it out on paper and not just holding it in your head can be a really big sort of stress relief. But I think being able to break down into what stock you're carrying. So, to me, particularly say something like fibre, calving cows down and having that hay, that might become your focus as to where you want to be able to put your hay that you can get, and then potentially, what else can you put in? It's very easy to manage I suppose, what else you can supplement in if you know what you've got in the first place. So it doesn't have to be a day-by-day breakdown or, and it doesn't have to be exact numbers. I think just having something written down, knowing where your stocks are at. I've actually seen people jump in and, talk about needing to buy hay when, we're like, hang on, but you've got enough. They're just, I suppose I put it down and say that, you're buying an expensive insurance premium, or, it was referred to me the other day as, the toilet paper shortage. Everybody went really hard at it, and those who actually probably needed it couldn't get it. But there was people with stockpiles and stockpiles of stuff that they then don't need.
Okay.
And it's a really expensive insurance premium, I guess I like to refer to it as, because, there's people that are, thinking they need to buy it and, we haven't done it. Whereas, if you can just pull numbers together and be able to say, okay, well, actually we're burning through it at the moment, but I know that this is my peak numbers, or, we can get through to the end. But not everyone, even for people that do feed budgets, generally it's okay, well, from Christmas through to, April, May, or maybe June, people, so even those with the best laid plans, probably aren't going to be expecting that they might still be needing to feed out through till August, September, potentially. So it's a challenging time for people. And even if you've got a feed budget, how long do you budget for?
Yeah. And I guess that's probably where, Donna, is there value in sort of tapping into your local resources like yourself, like your extension team, like others, that your farm consultant or others, to just bounce your budget off and your thinking, and just help sort of calibrate yourself. Because often there's, Donna, I don't know how many farms you work with, lots, that, you've got that kind of perspective from outside of the particular farm that you're working with that might help calibrate some of those assumptions.
Well, there's definitely, and I think what it definitely enables you to do is to be able to say, okay, yep, I've only got a month's worth, but what if we need to make it 2 months worth? Okay, we can get something in now to shandy it so the diet is also more consistent, rather than going, okay, next week I'm completely out of everything. Now what am I going to do?
Of course.
Having a budget, we can look at a stack and see that it's getting smaller and smaller, but, we can make rough calculations, we can make a guesstimate, and it's not going to be perfect. Feeding is never the perfect science, but if we can just do something a little bit better to try and, minimize that stress, and then knowing, okay, well, I don't have enough to feed the extra 20 head of calves that I'm carrying, or, let's get rid of them early rather than let them get skinny, and let's focus on, a lot of people were carrying export heifers and stuff like that, and they're still wanting to carry them. It's like you've got to be able to pick a point where you got to make a cut to make sure that your business is profitable on a long-term basis. Cutting a few numbers, extra cows that you don't need to carry, knowing that you've got heifers that you then can feed and make sure they come through in a good condition is really important too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd love to come back to that sort of feeding of young stock a little bit later, Donna. But one of the things that you mentioned that I'd love to explore a bit further, you talked about, if you've got, feed in the shed and, you can see that it's running low, you might be able to sort of spread that out a little bit further by sort of shandying in something else. What do you mean by that, Donna? And what are the sorts of things that people might be buying in to kind of stretch that feed that they've got on hand out for as long as they need?
Well, like grain prices have still been relative. If you look at the Dairy Australia information and the data that's come through over the last, many years now for particularly the grains and stuff like that, the last 5 or 6 years, wheat's still relatively, in the middle in the ballpark of pricing. So it may be feeding more grain and stuff like that. Okay. Then we still need to have fibre in there. It can be buying byproducts like, almond hulls, palm kernel, and these things come sort of, sporadically a little bit, but can also still then be expensive enough to get in if we don't have the infrastructures well to feed them. So grain often feeding it in the dairy, we don't get a lot of wastage. If you've got palm kernel or almond hulls or even some of the hays, if you're feeding that out in the paddock and it's just going into the mud, then, you've really got to, weigh up your options as to what's going to give you, the most return. Things like palm kernel are great. They're fillers, and almond hulls, they're not, but they may not be effective fibre. So sometimes we've got to be mindful of how much grain we've got if we don't have fibre as well. Because it's easy to say that that's cheap and it's effective and we don't waste it in the dairy, but we can't feed 20 kilos of grain in the dairy. That's not healthy for the animal either. So You've got to be able to work out where our balance is. And feeding palm kernel and grain is not effective either. We need an effective fibre source in there of some regards.
Yeah, so can you talk to us a little bit? I think most people probably know what an effective fibre source is, Donna, but can you, just to make sure that everyone's on the same page, talk to us about what you mean by effective fibre?
Effective fibre is just going to be something that gives a little bit, helps to create that rumen mat. And I suppose tickles our papillae, I guess, is probably the easy way as well, and just ensures that the rumen can continue to function and that we've got the right fibrolytic bugs as well. We're not just purely got lactic acid bugs that are going to be causing us acidosis and even on a subclinical acidosis era. There'll be people that have got products in to try and help with acidosis, but cows that chew their cud and cause them to chew their cud to break it down is also very effective for rumen health. So something that will ensure that cows will be chewing their cud effectively and making sure the rumen has a nice healthy environment.
So I'm wondering, Donna, if I can throw a bit of a scenario at you maybe. So you've kind of identified that grain prices generally are pretty on par with sort of where they've been in the last 5 years. So let's say, we're starting to get a little bit low on the silage that we've got on hand. We could potentially buffer that out from not buffer, sorry, it's not the right use of terminology. We could potentially extend that out by potentially upping the grain a little bit. How do we go about making sure that we've got adequate fibre in the diet and we are really mitigating that acidosis risk? It sounds like that's probably the main risk as effective fibre sources are challenging to get hold of.
Yeah, there'll be a couple of things in just, I guess we like to monitor, particularly in the milking cows. We can monitor that through a fat test scenario. Definitely there's times where our fat will be low, particularly during the spring. sometimes that can be, the amount of fat in the diet. But cud chewing, ensuring the cows are chewing their cud, their manures, I guess the old saying of being able to see the last plop, as the old Target 10 nutrition course would teach, being able to just see that they're not sort of, loose and squirty, or that the fat tests, the fat test nowadays, we feed lots of high fat grasses, and in spring we can get milk fat inversions purely just from the amount of fat in what we're feeding. It doesn't mean the animal's unhealthy, but we also can't rule out the fact that we've just, cows chewing their cud, making sure that manure consistency, going out and, being able to check the manure, which is sort of half of what I do. Going out, you always like to go and have a look at the poos when you
Especially, I mean, sounds like it's pretty easy to do, Donna, as you bring the cows in the afternoon when you've got a bit of daylight, is just making sure you're kind of routinely checking how they're going. And obviously as they're walking up the track and things like that, you get a pretty good idea. So Donna, if we've got a situation where, we've got hardly any grass cover, we are doing a fairly heavy sort of, feeding with bought in feed and things like that, and it is looking like, the cows are struggling a little bit from a fibre perspective, what do we do then? Do we call Donna?
No, well, I suppose it depends. Yeah, I think you need to be able to get someone in to have a look. There's definitely, it's not a one script scenario. It's not like this is going to be your answer. I think it's really about having someone come in and look at what options you have. What is your buffering? What is your what options do you have on farm? How do you sort of manage it? I have heard over in the west of farms, a colleague, Laura Tweddle, working with farms where, purely, it's just basically sacrifice paddock to sacrifice paddock. But also then managing, cows getting loose and worrying about that. And, it can be a salmonella bug potentially that they've picked up because they haven't been moving through enough paddocks, that there's sacrifice paddocks, and then they can get, there's other animal health issues. So it's not, there can be a couple of different things that we need to be watching for in these sort of, challenge times where we're trying to let grass get ahead. We're trying to make sure that we can grow feed, after some rain, but we're also trying not to, have increase in mastitis or salmonellas or these other nasty bugs that will then also come in to bite us a little bit too. So
yeah, such a good point, Donna. And issues very close to my heart, being a vet and working in the animal health space. Donna, a couple of things I was keen to explore a little bit further. I mean, you spoke about some farms sort of feeding lucerne, and then, other farms potentially sourcing cheaper byproducts, palm kernel, almond hulls and things like that. I was really interested. I heard you talking about, a cheap feed source becoming an expensive one with the wastage. Where people are potentially feeding byproducts or even hay, are there some sort of simple strategies that people can do to minimise that wastage and actually make sure that, for every dollar that they're putting into whatever's coming in, that it's actually, they're getting the value out of it?
Well, I think it's just looking at what have you got around that you can potentially feed into. Simple things like old water troughs, that half-broken water troughs that might be sitting around. You can put a bale of hay in there. You don't use the wastage, lose the wastage out the bottom. Feeding along fence lines and, but different fence lines. We can't be doing it all the time, rather than out in the middle of the paddock, or, minimising where the cows are going to be standing and sitting on some of that stuff, and really evaluating what is it that you are buying. Like you mentioned, sort of the lucerne, and there was a scenario for a group of farmers that we discussed the other week, and if fibre's what you're chasing, even though pasture hay could be ridiculously expensive, if it's purely MDF and fibre, yes, there's so many other benefits we might get from a lucerne hay, but it may not supply you with the fibre that you need. So weighing up the cost effective, okay, well, is it purely fibre that I need? And therefore, buying the expensive hay and then topping it up with grain might be more cost effective than, even though you think, oh, but it's, it's not that much different to buying a lucerne hay. Why would I not buy the lucerne hay? Because, pasture hay is ridiculous to buy at the moment. But you've also got to buy something that cows are prepared to eat. And maybe the pasture hay that's been sitting in someone's paddock along their fence line that's half grown up over might also not be the best alternative either. But looking at what you've got, there are so many things on farm, old trailers and, things that people can use to help minimise the amount of loss. Obviously a lot of people in the years have invested in bail-up feeders and things like that nothing gets wasted out the bottom. But I think also just, cows will sometimes also like to play with and throw around and waste stuff. But yeah, just I think looking at what you've got on farm, there is things that people have on farm that they can probably make use of, and sometimes it's thinking outside the square as to what you've got.
Yeah, absolutely. And it sounds, Donna, like there might be some advantages, as challenging as it is, maybe even to get off farm and head along to a discussion group locally, maybe where there's others that are facing the same sort of challenges that you are, you might, pick up some tips and tricks that don't cost the earth that can at least get you through the next couple of months. So Donna, we touched a little bit on, people potentially carrying extra stocks that they may not need or they'd like to hang on to, but maybe really kind of chewing into that feed budget. Young stock's something that, I often worry about in times like this. You're not getting that kind of immediate return from them in milk production, and they often are sort of the first group to get forgotten about. Are there cost-effective ways that we can kind of keep our young stock going, or should we be looking at, reducing the numbers that we're carrying and then just focusing on feeding the ones that we've got left really well? What's your sort of recommendations around, young stock and other sort of extra stock that you've got on farm?
Well, I think it depends on what feed you have got for those, and what their situation is. Obviously, keeping some grain and those sorts of things in the diet, where perhaps maybe they haven't always kept that in, if they've still got some fibre, or if they've still got some feed going into them. But I think carrying those extra numbers can be a challenge. I think there are definitely farms out there that may make the decision not to carry any young stock and look to buy in older cattle later on, or heifers or whatever. And I think if you're looking at paying $700 or $800 for lucerne hay to feed calves, and you can perhaps buy in heifers or replacement cows for $1,500, I think you've actually, depending on how attached we can get to our animals or where it fits in our breeding program or our farm program, whether you're a closed herd or whatever, they're all things that people need to be able to consider. Because perhaps not continuing, and I guess people have already brought them such a long way now. I guess the light is at the end of the tunnel. There has been a little bit of rain, but bringing in undersized animals. But I think one of the biggest things is, as dairy farmers, we like to, we often like to sort of have a dig at the beef farmer, and, with the old tractor, and they don't have, all these sorts of things. But I can tell you one thing that the beef farmer has that a lot of dairy farmers really need to invest in is a set of scales. And I say it every time, because weighing your young stock, going into breeding now, if, there's no point getting to October and saying, oh, they look a little bit small. Maybe we should have done something about that, weighing heifers and stuff now, particularly to know whether, are they going to be any good to join? Are you going to need to carry over, and what's that cost going to be? But yeah, so many dairy farmers, who don't have a set of scales, and we always make the joke about the poor old beef farmers, but, no, you really need to be weighing your young stock. And it's not an every month job, but pick your key points where you can make a difference. And if you can weigh your young stock now, where you have 3 months to work out whether you make a plan.
Maybe only offload some of those smaller ones that are going to cost a lot to bring up to speed. Hey, Donna, I've got a statistic for you that I literally is hot off the press. So I got a consultant that works with us at Dairy Australia to look at all of the data that we've got in the central data repository, all the herd testing herds, and only 26% of farms achieve the heifers on targets of a heifer or 2-year-old producing 85% of their mature cow weights. So that's over 70% of farms where their 2-year-olds are just not stacking up. So I love your point about the scales. It's a huge opportunity. I think that probably it's been a little bit underappreciated to now, but really challenging to overcome at the moment when feed's so expensive. But it's so important to be able to track how they're going, and then know that you sort of either making the decision to invest now, or as you suggested, sort of offloading them and potentially bringing in some older animals at a later point. Such a good point.
And we always see that. Like, I mean, I love it when I go onto a farm and I have to ask where their heifers are, particularly the 3-year-olds, because often I can pick the 3-year-olds towards the end of lactation, or just about to calve, because, the heifers might calve down well, but I know that they haven't been looked after that well when I can pick the 3-year-olds out. And I love being able to say to some of my farms, I can't find where your 3-year-olds and, or those are, because, the heifers might come in and they look okay, but they're still going to struggle so much in that first year. Whereas if we can really get them up to that, 90% of their mature weight, they just manage so much better, and they can just compete so much, particularly when feed's short. We need them to be able to compete to get their fair share. Otherwise, they really do struggle then for the coming couple of years. And it's just such a short, these droughts don't last forever. The feed shortages don't last forever. But, you've got to make sure that you don't end up with a roll-on effect. So make decisions now that don't affect your future, because the sun shines again, the rain does come again, and feed will be available again. And, or you can have, you can make decisions now that will affect you long term.
Yeah, Donna, that's such a really kind of nice summary, I guess, of the things that we're talking about. Is yes, we need to be making kind of immediate short-term decisions, but also thinking about some of the longer-term kind of impacts of the decisions. Donna, I guess one of the things that I'm keen to ask you is, for anyone that's listening to this podcast, what's the first thing that you want them to do once, we hear the outro music of the podcast? What do you want them to go and do?
Well, I suppose probably just go down and write down, do they have a bit of a plan, put it on paper to share it with those around them. Often it can be one partner in a team that's carrying the burden of everything, but that doesn't mean that it's not felt by the other one. So if you're not sitting down and having those conversations together, there are options out there. I think Agriculture Victoria do have the option that people can look up in their area and apply to have someone come and see them and come and do a 3-hour consult with them, even if that is just to do a feed budget and whatever. There is no cost attached to that for people. I haven't looked it up, but I believe it's on, the AgVic, and you just apply for that and have someone come down and just, look at the forest through the trees. Just be able to get it out of your head and put it onto paper, and potentially just have someone come in and help you if you need that. But share that with other farmers. Share your plan with your partner, your employee, whatever. Know then that you feel confident in your plan, and just be happy to talk to somebody about it if you're feeling unsure, and those scenarios. So, maybe go and get a set of scales. That's probably the last thing you want to spend your money on at the moment. Borrow a set of scales. There'll be departments, there'll be places, there'll be a neighbour. Someone will go and ask the beef farmer down the road to borrow his scales and check your heifers as well.
Yeah, such great points, Donna. So a fair few farms are either calving or they're about to start calving. In the current sort of situation, what do farmers need to be thinking about as they're sort of planning on feeding those springers and really getting them off to the best start?
Well, we know that obviously getting through the dry period and the impacts that that dry period can have on our cows is critical, particularly even on a fertility level. It all starts back in the dry period. So we're trying to sort of look after them as best we can, and we know that we're used to having high levels of fibre or all that, and it's just a hay diet and things like that, but having some grain potentially going into them through there. But just being able to sort of pick a system to minimise, I guess, the health impacts on them so that they do calve well. If you're doing, if you're feeding an anionic type lean feed, it doesn't always have to be an anionic. So we do have, transition feeding is about preparing the rumen. So there's transition feeding, which is about preparing the rumen, making sure the cow goes from like to like to like, having, that sort of smoother element. And then there's obviously the metabolic manipulation, which is our mag chloride in the water through to, anionic salts, anything that can be a lean feed. If we're using an anionic approach, so the decat approach, you may have lots of different hays. Traditionally you might have one hay supplier who supplied you, and you've got a feed test done on that hay, and you know where you're at and you can allocate your decat. But if you're sort of pulling the last bales from here and there, urine pH testing the animals can be a really easy and effective way of just knowing whether you've got that diet right. Also, because you may be just buying that lead feed that you've always fed and gone, well, we're a bit short for feed, so we'll just feed more of it. Now, if we're over decatting the cows, we also then can be causing milk fever. So milk fever doesn't just have to come from not giving them enough. It can actually come from overdoing it as well. So maybe doing some urine pH testing, getting some strips and just testing. 8 cows, I think, is, I heard a podcast talking about that. Jesse Goff said he asked some statisticians what's the magic number when it comes to if they're, testing 100 cows. They said 8. And he said, what if there's 50? Test 8. What if there's 8? Test 8. Just test 8 cows and see whether you're potentially on a yo-yo of an up and down. If you've got really low pH, a 5 and 8s, and they've all been on it for the same time, well, then we're probably seeing cows that are off feed, and then that can be an impact as well. So, but, testing is generally the ideal of your hay, but we know that people will have different, might have sort of half load here and a half load there and whatever. But again, if you've got half loads, can we sort of shandy that through and keep the like to like? And then being kind to them as in that first 3 days post-calving, making sure that the grains, a lot of people are feeding more grain, lifting that grain gradually, making sure that they're, if you can lift it, but don't be too slow, knowing how to sort of, charge them up a little bit. So there's different ways of being able to approach it. And, most nutritionists will talk you through different alternatives of what might suit your system. There might be guys that don't have any hay and plenty of grass, or other byproducts. So the phosphorus binding products may be the best suited in that scenario as well. So there are options, and there's ways and means of being able to. But the biggest key is just getting the cow healthy and ready to start the race, I guess. It's sort of the pre-season before the game.
Yeah, absolutely. And Donna, you mentioned just briefly sort of, the merits of feed testing. Obviously, in an ideal world, we'd love to be able to do that. Is it still worth doing that? And, how important is it when you're purchasing feed and things like that to have feed tests on them, at least just the, the standard panel?
Well, I think it is important to sort of know what you've got. I've definitely had some farms this year that, stacks of silage, we've entered into older stacks, or they've had, different stacks, and we go from a really beautiful lush stack where all of a sudden we're like, whoa, hang on, we need to find a fibre source. We've just plummeted everything, to a stack where we're going, oh, hang on, we need to throw more energy in there. We probably should have shared that one with that one. Knowledge is power, no matter what, where or what you have. When you're buying in feed, it can be a bit of a challenge, because usually you're expected to, if you've ordered it, you're expected just to take it. But I think don't be afraid to turn it around if it's not what you want. But it's not always the truck driver's fault. Sometimes there are guys there that are delivering who are just being asked to find whatever's available. But I think there is definitely still some good stuff. But looking at the feed test that's supplied doesn't always correspond with what you see, but it doesn't necessarily, depending on where it's been shedded. But, having your own feed test can put your own mind at ease. It doesn't have to be that expensive. Generally, it's under $100. You can get them sent off. But one that's got nutritional information is what I like. I like a bit more detail in what I've got. I want to know digestibilities. I want to know, a bit more of the NDFs and starches, because depending on what we're getting, I like a bit of detail in what I'm looking at. But it's all got to be relative, and it's got to correspond with what you've got, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. That's awesome. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. It's been a wonderful discussion, and you're a wealth of knowledge, and I'm sure it won't be the last time that we bring you on, Donna, but really appreciate it.
That's all right. Thank you.
Thank you for joining today's Dairy Pod episode. We hope you found it enjoyable and insightful. For more information, check out the episode notes. You can stay up to date by following Dairy Pod on your favourite podcast platform. To get in touch, visit dairyaustralia.com.au. Until next time, take care.